my favorite quotes or statements is this: the cause of all suffering is ignorance. And the reason I like this statement so much is because of the depth of it. The more you look at it, the deeper it really goes. It's kind of like an abyss in the shape of a linguistic utterance. And when you take it to the fullest consequence, something remarkable happens. Because not only does it strike the implication that we bring our suffering upon ourselves because there are things we don't know or things that we are blinded to or unaware of, but it also points to a way out of this suffering. Be less ignorant, or stated positively, get wise and suffer less. But there's a problem because it doesn't tell us what is causing our suffering. And so there's a deeper question posed here, which is what is beneath our suffering? What is driving our suffering? And in this post-industrial, late modern, digital age in which knowledge has become so ubiquitous, we have basically saturated our culture in knowledge to the ridiculous degree that we can pull almost any piece of knowledge out of thin air. And viewed in that light, this statement that the cause of all suffering is ignorance becomes really interesting, right? Because when we want to know what is driving our ignorance, what is beneath our ignorance, it certainly is not scarcity, nor is it access to knowledge. And for the purposes of this video, I will argue that it is a kind of intellectual laziness. It's basically a kind of superficiality that drives our ignorance. And therefore you can restate this quote to the more precise version, I would argue, that the cause of all our suffering is a lack of depth. In this video, we'll unpack this problem of lack of depth. Why is lack of depth dangerous? Why is it important? Why is it interesting? And most importantly, how can we find a way of loosening this grip that superficiality has upon us? And how can we begin to find avenues into a deeper relationship with being? If that is in any way interesting to you, well then whoopie fucking do. As we established in the last video, any journey inwardly, which is not radically founded upon depth, is inherently perverse. Because it'll run the risk of producing this kind of a performative behaviorism in which we express all the right actions without addressing the deeper emotional issues that drive all our unbeneficial and unhealthy patterns. In fact, I would argue that depth is the single best heuristic we have for quality. And that is regardless of domain, whether we're talking politics or relationships or art or science. Depth is really what draws us to a good story, draws us to interesting people, or draws us to powerful explanatory frames. Depth is our measure of quality. And that doesn't mean that we're not indeed drowning ourselves in superficiality. We are. But that raises the question, is it not in fact this lack of depth that explains why we feel so empty inside so much of the time? But let's dive a little deeper into this problem of depth, because what do we even mean by it? Like, what are we pointing to with this term? Depth. In fact, let's all just take a couple of minutes to think about it. What in the actual fuck is depth? Now, I don't know about you, but to me, this word is difficult to define. But I think this difficulty in defining it points to an inherent aspect of it. Because depth is by definition not obvious. In fact, it's almost as if depth is the antithesis of obvious. There's something inherently secret about it. But perhaps this can serve as the beginning of a definition. In information theory, depth is correlated with what is called exformation, which is defined as that which is not said but still present in a message. And I don't know about you, but that, to me, that sounds very much like a kind of poetry. And like poetry, depth has this element of things are not what they seem. It hints at something hidden going on, that there's more than what meets the eye, which is why it's so difficult to pinpoint, but also why it's so fucking interesting. And maybe it also explains why depth is typically associated with things like paradox, the counterintuitive, contradiction, the unconscious, and why it's typically also expressed through things like myth. But for our purposes, let's define depth as that which lies on the edge of what we can grasp. Okay, so that's all very well and good, but insofar as we agree with the premise that the cause of our suffering is superficiality, the question still remains, how can we awaken ourselves from this slumber of the objective world, of phones, of scrolling, of faces and bodies and luxury objects, and awaken into a deeper engagement with life that honors the profundity of the situation that we're in? Insofar as we define depth as that which lies on the edge of what we can grasp, perhaps the answer to that question will vary from person to person, but I've made a list and I've divided it into 3 different categories. Things we can orient ourselves towards, things we can contemplate, and questions we can ask ourselves. Now, obviously, this list is not exhaustive, but it can serve as an entry point, if nothing else. We can orient ourselves towards the unconscious. We can orient ourselves towards the inner abyss, asking things about the unconscious, asking questions about what we are blind to or what we are in denial about. In fact, any kind of introspection is powerful as an avenue into depth. The power of myth as a map of the deeper aspects of the human condition, and orienting ourselves towards any kind of meta perspective, taking a step back, seeing or at least catching a glimpse of that bigger picture, realizing that what we thought was the horizon of reality was merely a frame. That's always a powerful step into a deeper relation to being. We can contemplate death and our own mortality. We can contemplate our connectedness to everything. I also find that the bigger questions of cosmology can be very powerful, like, do I think the universe came out of nothing, or do I think it has always been there? We can contemplate our own capacity for evil. We can ask ourselves, who am I? And what is the self? Where does thoughts come from? We can ask ourselves, how can I reframe my experience of life in this moment? And how might such a reframe actually make my life better? We can ask ourselves, what are some of the hidden beliefs that are actually controlling my life? Or we can ask, are we in fact godlike beings stomping around like zombies? What is interesting about an exercise like this is that it, of course, becomes very obvious that the list of questions we can ask ourselves to dive into the depth of life is endless. And I'd be curious to hear, first of all, what other questions might act as avenues into depth for you. And I'd also be curious to hear what your definition of depth was. So if you'd be willing to post that in the comments, I'd be very honored to read it. And I don't really know how to end this, so I guess I'll just